every 2 minutes, a child dies of malaria. And when I started in the Novartis Malaria Initiative, well over a decade ago, that statistic was a lot worse. There was actually one child that died every 45 seconds. So progress has been made thanks to the use of those mosquito bed nets to prevent mosquito biting and the use of diagnostics and effective treatments. In fact, thanks to all of those measures together, the malaria-related Millennium Development Goals were achieved a few years ago. So we're now on a path with the Sustainable Development Goals to achieve 90% reduction of this disease burden by 2030. If you look a little bit at history, like the previous century, it is estimated that between 150 and 300 million people died because of malaria infection. And most of those victims were really in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia and in the Amazon regions. That is not to say that there is still today 40% of the world's population at risk of getting malaria, because living in regions where transmission still happens. If we go back further in history, we see many examples of how malaria was already kind of alluded to before the name or the term was invented. On clay tablets from Mesopotamia, there was reference to periodic fevers, and that was suggestive of malaria. And in the Indian scriptures of 1,000 years before Christ, there was mention of the king of diseases. Now, malaria reached Europe probably in the 1st century. It was in Rome. And later then, soldiers and merchants transported the disease up northwards, here to England, to Denmark even. And many historians actually postulate that malaria was a leading factor in the fall of Rome. And that's also the time when the term malaria, so bad air, was used. Because people believed that those evil vapors were causing the swamp fevers in the end. Now, malaria was also a leading obstacle in the colonization of Africa. When Portuguese traders landed on the African continent in the late 1400s or early 1500s, they were the first foreigners to be confronted with malaria. And later on, when colonial powers wanted to put outposts on the continent, they were often repelled because of malaria and other tropical diseases. And to the point that actually in the 18th century, the area of West and Central Africa got known as the white man's grave. And then it was in the 19th century that the Surgeon Major Ronald Ross, who served in the British Indian Medical Service, was the first to discover the malaria parasites mosquito stages. That was a major discovery because it has helped to then further understand how you can actually develop a cure for malaria. And for his work, he got a Nobel Prize in 1902. And as a treatment for malaria, people had figured out that the bark, the bitter bark of a tree that is growing in the Andes area, the cinchona tree, produces quinine. And that has been very effective for a long, long time. And it's interesting actually that botanists from my home country, the Netherlands, but also from this country, were really looking everywhere to find those trees and to get the seeds. And then actually to use the climate in the colonies, like in India and Ceylon and the Dutch East Indies, to set up plantations to really get a lot of those trees and the bark to treat malaria. Now the problem was with transplanting from one continent to the other, there was a loss of yield. And so soon the British lost interest in this. And then opportunistically there was an Englishman living in Peru who had collected 14 pounds of seeds of this tree. And then the Dutch bought it for a few guilders. And soon afterwards, were then basically taking care of 80% of the world's production of this quinine that has been really cultivated in the Java island of Indonesia until World War II. Now, and then basically quinine was succeeded by another product from nature. And that product really was the byproduct of a war. Can something good from war happen? Yes, indeed. During the Vietnam War, where Viet Cong soldiers were exposed to malaria as they kind of transported through these malaria-infested regions, they didn't have protection. And they had at some point more casualties because of malaria than from acts of war. The American troops already had a cure for malaria that protected their troops. But of course, in the midst of the Cold War, that was not accessible. So the Viet Cong leadership, Ho Chi Minh, addressed a request to its neighbors in Beijing and said, can you please help us out? We need a cure for malaria. And that is now exactly half a century ago, in 1967, that 800 scientists were ordered by the central government in Beijing to change their work and focus on finding a cure for malaria. So there were two groups. One group had to go and look into Chinese traditional medicine, and the other group more in kind of modern pharmaceutical ways of finding cures. But the first group really started digging into old scriptures from the Han Dynasty. 167 years before Christ, they found reference to a plant called sweet wormwood. And it was written, to reduce fever, take a handful of sweet wormwood, soak it in water, squeeze the juice, and drink it all. And little did people then know that that fever was actually caused by malaria. And indeed, that plant was then rediscovered in the late 60s, early 70s. And a Chinese scientist, a woman, Dr. Yu Tu, was the one that was able to extract this artemisinin from this plant in such a way that it is actually pharmaceutically active. And for that work, she got 2 years ago the Nobel Prize, which was a major achievement for the Chinese. And this product was then further developed in China initially in the 70s and 80s by the Academy of Military and Medical Sciences. And then they realized, if this product has to, be used worldwide, it will need kind of global pharmaceutical development expertise, which at that time the Chinese didn't have. And then my company, there was people out there in the year 1990, just following this photo that we saw of the Tiananmen Square, when afterwards China started slowly to open up. And they met with a professor who had indeed researched malaria drugs and said, would you be willing to kind of collaborate with us so that we can actually develop this and make this available ultimately to the entire world? And that collaboration has been extremely successful, led to the very first Chinese invention that got global patent protection in the late 90s. Now, this was a drug that was in the research pipeline of the companies, the predecessor companies of Novartis, then called Seba and Sandoz. And so the management was looking at, what of these development projects is promising from a financial return point of view. And a drug for malaria was not exactly high on the list in terms of attractiveness. However, the chairman of our company asked one question to the development team and said, if we would not pursue development of this drug, would patients have something comparably effective and safe to treat malaria? And the answer was no. There will be nothing as effective. And so he then ordered the teams to say, we need to make money available to develop this, even if there is no financial return to be expected from it. And nobody had thought in those days, in the mid-90s that was, that 20 years afterwards, hundreds of millions of people patients that were suffering from malaria would be cured using this treatment that is based on an ancient Chinese traditional medicine. And the journey of that patient access really started in 2001, when Novartis entered into a groundbreaking collaboration with the World Health Organization. And under the terms of a memorandum of understanding, the company committed to the sale of these drugs to governments and to NGOs without profit. And so over time, 850 million of these treatments have been made available, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the original tablets for this drug, were just developed to be used by adults, patients, by children. But, small children, they cannot swallow tablets whole, even though they're small tablets. So what mothers would then do, they would crush the tablets, and then, you get this bitter taste that is typical of antimalarials. So, you need to mix it with some mashed banana or mango or honey. But that practice, in the end, can also lead to kind of spilling of medicine. And if you don't have something sweet to mix it with, the child might spit it out. So all at risk of, therefore, sub-therapeutic outcomes, which also then has the risk of developing resistance. So that's why we then embarked on a collaboration with the product development group, a public-private partnership with Medicines for Malaria Venture in Geneva, a group that has been supported still also by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so we developed a child-friendly formulation, kind of a dispersible tablet that you can drop into a little bit of liquid and it makes a nice syrup. Actually, I brought a package of that drug. This is how we are packaging this. Very different than what we typically do when we make pharmaceuticals. But there's a lot of pictorials on it, and that's really helpful for people that may not yet be fully literate to understand instructions, when to take it, for which patient category, and importantly, why it is important to take the treatment for its full 3-day course. Because, we have actually illustrated it with parasites, and every day that you take the doses, the parasite load decreases in your body. But the problem is that the drug works so fast, people might feel very well after 1 or 2 days and stop treating. And then you have the risk of kind of relapse of the disease and resistance development. So this packaging really helps to do the right thing, to help treatment compliance, and it was awarded by the Healthcare Packaging Compliance Council in Europe for indeed promoting treatment adherence. A few other things that we are doing to help in the fight against malaria is creating best practice workshops for policymakers in malaria-endemic countries, where we exchange about, how do you, diagnose people, how do you actually, provide public awareness campaigns so that people understand what to do when they have symptoms of malaria. And so those workshops are really a good platform for, Senegal to tell a story that Kenya can learn from, and vice versa. We also do a lot of training, healthcare workers, nurses, disease awareness for patients as well. Talking about nurses, if you get sick in sub-Saharan Africa, the chance that you get treated when you go to a clinic by a nurse is far bigger than that you would see a doctor at all. So it's really nurses that bear the brunt of taking care of malaria patients. And also here, a nurse that has been featured in today's photo exhibition is Lady Agnes from Kenya, from the Kisumu area, which is in western Kenya, close to the Lake Victoria, one of the most malarious places in Africa. And she is really a 35-year veteran. She works in the Kombewa clinic, that is also known there as the Walter Reed Project, where she tirelessly provides local leadership on how to deal with malaria, how to inform the communities, how you can prevent the disease. And so she actually got malaria during the pregnancy of her youngest child, and she was therefore so motivated and said, we need to find a way to treat this disease and make sure that people, prevent the disease. you know, kind of when you go out in the night, make sure you don't get bitten by a mosquito. Apply repellents or long sleeves and sleep under those mosquito-treated, insecticide-treated bed nets. Now, in that clinic, also lots of other work is being done, kind of clinical research, vaccines. Glaxo here from the UK has done major work for a vaccine that was also researched there. This pediatric formulation of Coartem was also researched in that clinic. And actually, in a couple of months from now, we will start new clinical trials for potentially the next generation of antimalarials that may come out. Now, so Lady Agnes really goes out with community health workers, with diagnostics, collecting blood samples, and really is a major force. It's a huge task for her, but what we are seeing in that region of Kenya is that lives are being saved, and the death rate of malaria is falling, and that is her motivation to carry on. And I would say it's only through such type of partnerships at the global level, at the local level, that we can ultimately become successful in the fight against malaria. We'll need funding. Today, already $2.7 billion are available for malaria per year. But to achieve those sustainable development goals in 2030, we'll probably need to double or even triple that amount. And the UK is very well positioned to actually help catalyze extra funding. In a couple of months, here in London, will be hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government, 52 countries represented, and that is an important platform to perhaps also advocate for better malaria control. And I would say that this exhibition, Daniela, that you have initiated, is in its own original way also a very important way of creating awareness about the disease. There was a term given by the late Alan McGill. He used to work for the Walter Reed Institute in the US, later for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle. And he said, malaria delendum est. Malaria must be combated, must be overcome. And you can also participate. There's many NGOs here in the UK, for example, Malaria No More, Malaria Consortium, that all kind of battle this fight against malaria. In concluding, let me share a short personal anecdote. What has really struck me when I traveled to Africa. I was in Zambia, and I saw a mother whose child had just been cured from malaria. And I saw the joy and the relief in her eyes because she had been carrying her baby for an hour or two on a dirt road, not knowing whether she would find the right medicine in that clinic. Because her neighbor, a few weeks before, had lost a child because the medicine then, the chloroquine, was no longer effective. But this mother got Coartem for her child, and the child was healed. And then the physicians there said, well, you don't realize, Hans, what a blessing this is, this drug for our people. It's actually an answer to many prayers. So this has changed a lot. So for the Zambians, they called this drug differently. They gave it so-called nickname, Kwatemwa. I said, what does that mean? Well, they said that's local language for I am happy. And so I'm happy too, and I'm grateful for working for a company that has done a great deal for improving access to these life-saving medicines. And I'm grateful for the initiative here to actually also feature the story of Lady Agnes in Kenya. Thank you.